This is a re-recording of the short presentation I made at the launch of the ICRT Global on November the 4th at its launch event. The presentation I was asked to prepare and present is on the growth of the responsible tourism movement. The origins in the UK date back to VSO's interest in the mid-1990s in the issue of tourism and whether it could or could not be made more ethical. VSO surveyed its volunteers working in villages around the world, and the big issue that came forward from those volunteers was tourism. It's worth reflecting that had VSO done the same exercise a year or two later, the main issue may well have been HIV/AIDS, and none of this work on responsible tourism in the UK would have commenced. The outcome of the work I did with the Association of Independent Tour Operators at the behest and with funding from VSO was the ATO Responsible Tourism Guidelines published in 2000. ATO discovered through the research work that I did with them that very many of their member tour operators were already engaged in putting back substantial resources into destinations to try to improve the lives and the environments and cultural environment of people living in the destinations that their travellers love to visit. The outcome of that process with ATO was the first set of responsible tourism guidelines. Subsequently, we saw the 2001 Sustainable Tourism Initiative, which was led by the Blair government. They got together 40 plus organisations, including all of the major outbound tour operators, to come to a common position to take to the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002. Responsibility for that policy passed to Peter Hain, the Foreign Office Minister, and he described the objective as to ensure that tourism, as well as being good for the traveller, improved the quality of life of local people. That required the promotion of local suppliers to provide better local livelihoods and for tourism developments to be undertaken so that rather than making excessive demands on local resources, they preserve the environment for the benefit of the local community and the visitors. And I'd like just to acknowledge the fact that Jane Ashton, who is here today, and Martin Brackenbury are amongst the few remaining active in the travel and tourism industry from this period, and both of them were engaged with the Sustainable Tourism Initiative. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the post-apartheid government published in 1996 the Development and Promotion of Tourism in South Africa. And that white paper proposed responsible tourism as the key guiding principle for tourism development. You can see from the quote from the white paper at 3.4 is that they understood the importance of the sustainable use of the environment and engaging local communities in the industry, as well as safety and security of visitors and responsible government employees, employers, unions, and local communities. They understood from very early in the process that it would require the whole community and a whole of government approach to achieve responsible tourism. But they also saw that responsible tourism is not a luxury for South Africa, but rather an absolute necessity if the country was to build a successful and sustainable tourism industry. In 2002, we were able to publish the Cape Town Declaration, which talked about taking responsibility for achieving sustainable tourism and creating better places for people to live in and for people to visit. And I take a lot of pleasure from the fact that to create better places for people to live in and for people to visit has become something of a meme. You often see it reproduced in a small variety of forms, one of which is great places to live are great places to visit, and obviously that's true too. Sometimes people fail the litmus test and talk about making great places for people to visit first, and secondarily great places for people to live in. That is definitely an indication that the person has not understood it properly. The Cape Town Declaration laid out what has become or became the first agenda for the responsible tourism movement. On the left-hand side there are the guidelines for responsible tourism that I was involved in writing for the South African government, which we published in 2001. They are still live in South Africa, although to be honest, not much talked about or used now. Those guidelines were emerged from a process of consultation with the industry and with communities across South Africa. At the 2002 Cape Town Conference on Responsible Tourism in Destinations, I decided to at least create the opportunity for international centres for responsible tourism, and we established the Responsible Tourism Partnership to promote the concept of responsible tourism and to enable people to be in touch through the networks with each other. The ICRT.global, which we're launching today, is really a further step on the road to making a reality of those aspirations. Now, obviously, there is nothing new under the sun, and I wouldn't want to do anything but recognise the importance of Jos Krippendorf's work. I mean, the origination really of the concept of responsible tourism goes back to Jos Krippendorf, who understood that using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we would begin to self-realize, and by self-realizing we would want more responsible forms of tourism. He also made the point that every individual tourist builds up or destroys human values while traveling, and that orders and prohibitions will not do the job. It's not a bad conscience that we need to make progress, but rather positive experience, not the feeling of compulsion, but rather the feeling of responsibility. Very importantly, he called for rebellious tourists and rebellious locals, that we needed people who were going to demand that tourism was made better, that they could have better experiences and the impacts on local communities could be more positive and less adverse. I've taken those ideas up in a couple of subsequent books, but I absolutely want to recognise the foresight of Jos Krippendorf in recognising the importance of the concept of responsibility and putting it at the heart of making tourism better. So what is responsible tourism? Well, it's a triple bottom line approach to managing tourism. The dreadful concept of DMO, so often was reduced to marketing, needs to be expanded and is being expanded now to mean the management of a destination, recognizing that marketing is just one of the tools available in managing a destination. So it's a triple bottom line approach: economic, social and environmental. It's a way of traveling which offers better experiences, and ResponsibleTravel.com has grown massively by offering that, as have many other tour operators. It's a movement because people engage for different reasons. They engage with different purposes. All that they have in common is the desire to take responsibility, to make change, and to change tourism for the better. It is inevitably diverse because people come from different cultures, they come from different places, and those cultures, those destinations have different cultures, they're different places, and they have different organizations and forms of administration. Responsible tourism is inherently diverse. What it has in common is that it's characterized by transparency. You have to accept, if you're going to be part of the movement, you have to accept the responsibility to make tourism better. You have to be willing to take action, and you have to be willing to talk about and report the difference that you've made. So responsible tourism is the opposite of irresponsible, obviously, but it's also the opposite of over-tourism. Over-tourism happens because we fail to take responsibility for managing tourism to make sure that it remains sustainable, making a positive contribution to the destination. So, responsible tourism is what we do to make tourism more sustainable. It's about how we use tourism. And one of the questions to ask, I think, politicians particularly, is whether the politician wants the destination, his constituency, to be used by tourism, or whether he or she wants to use tourism to make better lives for the people who live there and to maintain their cultural and natural heritage. So responsible tourism requires us to say what we're doing to make tourism better, and that we're transparent about what we achieve. It is about making better places for people to live in, better places for people to visit, in that order. But critically, we need to understand that responsibility drives our journey to sustainability. We won't get there in any other way. Failure to take responsibility when we are taking our holidays in other people's homes results in a backlash. In Barcelona, people quite rightly argue that the beach adjacent to their homes is where they take their rest. It's a neighbourhood, not a holiday resort. And the piece of graffiti, a rather beautiful piece of cartoon graffiti on the right, makes the point very powerfully. Now, the word itself doesn't particularly matter. There are many ways in which we can be responsible. The name, the word, is not the important bit. And to quote Shakespeare, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. It's the action that matters. Responsible is a doing word. Sustainability describes an objective. Responsibility drives our journey to sustainability. But it's not a brand, although it can carry a market advantage, and responsibletravel.com has demonstrated that. All forms of tourism can be more responsible. And many of those forms of tourism, which carry the attractive labels, ecotourism, regenerative, positive, net positive, can be nothing more than greenwashing. If we take those claims seriously, whatever the claim, there needs to be evidence that it has made tourism better. The evidence really matters. And too often, people are not challenged for the evidence of how their form of ecotourism contributes more than other forms of tourism, how they have regenerated anything through tourism, how they've made any kind of net positive impact. We need to hold people to account and challenge them to reveal the evidence for what they've achieved. Just using the label isn't enough. Transparency about the positive impact and the evidence really matters. In the Responsible Tourism Awards, which has been going since 2004, we've looked for the evidence, we've looked for replicability, we've looked for innovation. We seek to highlight good proven practice and to promote them so that others might copy and emulate and adapt those strategies. And we look for businesses which are like businesses and destinations and organisations which are likely to have influence. So in terms of responsible tourism going mainstream, clearly it hasn't, but it has grown. And if we look back to the origins, I'd point to the beginning of Environment Awareness Day at WTM in 1994, the launch of responsibletravel.com, which I was involved with Justin Francis, although I subsequently sold my shares, so the potential conflict of interest given the consultancy work I was doing. 2001, the UK Government Sustainable Tourism Initiative. 2003, the Travel Foundation. 2004, the Responsible Tourism Awards. And then in 2007, a really big step forward when we got World Responsible Tourism Day at World Travel Market. And I'd like to acknowledge Simon Greenberry, Jane Larkham and Fiona Jeffrey for that. And the big growth which came when Simon Press was appointed as show director subsequently. 2011, the launch of the Responsible Tourism Program at Arabian Travel Market, and 2014 at WTM Latin America. The history of the Responsible Tourism Program, blogs and awards can all be found on the Responsible Tourism Partnership website. We've had one really big failure, in my view, which was the pro-poor tourism movement, which was a part of sustainable tourism, and where I first met Adam Abar, who's here with us today from the Gambia. In 1992, the Rio Conference on Sustainable Development set up the Sustainable Development Commission, and it wasn't until CSD 7 at the UN that the focus on tourism and poverty reduction, which had been in the Rio conference on sustainable development, actually met. The Pro-Poor Tourism Partnership with myself, Caroline Ashley from ODI and Dilys Rowe from IIED worked really hard to promote the idea of pro-poor tourism and published a great deal on it. The British government then introduced the Tourism Challenge Fund, and we won a grant to work in the Gambia on ways of increasing market access. Sadly, the findings were never implemented. Effectively, what happened to pro-poor tourism was that existing consultancy firms, development agencies and NGOs adopted the language but continued with business as usual. And of course, the Millennium Development Goals gave way to the Sustainable Development Goals, and business as usual with a mere nod to being inclusive of local communities and of the economically poor and the economically disadvantaged in travel and tourism. It is a classic example of failure where we were unable to maintain the concept, and it was taken over and diluted by existing established interests, and pro-poor was diluted to mean simply inclusive, and inclusive was never properly defined. But then came the big breakthrough. In 2008, Dr. Venu invited me to bring the second conference on responsible tourism in destinations. The first had been in 2002 in Cape Town, to bring that conference to Kerala. Dr. Venu was the Secretary for Tourism in Kerala, and his objective was to share learnings from around the world about how responsible tourism could be developed with destinations. And we brought together about 500 people. The consequence of that was that there were experiments in four villages in Kerala. Kumarakoram, the one led by Rupesh Kumar, was easily the most successful. Did two things. They adapted township tours from South Africa to create village life experiences, which enabled tourists to book a commissionable tour, a small group, to visit different households in a village to learn about the productive activities of those villages, and each of the households which is visited receives a fee for accepting the tourists to attend, very much like the best of the township tours in South Africa. And Rupesh adapted the producer cooperatives concept that Adam Abar had started in the Gambia, where groups of essentially subsistence farmers were brought together to produce fruit and vegetables, particularly for the resorts and hotels, but only by working together in groups was it possible to produce a sufficient scale to supply the hotels and resorts. Both of those initiatives originated in Africa, were adapted and developed in Kerala, and have been extremely successful. In 2015, I was challenged along with Rupesh by the Minister of Tourism in Kerala to demonstrate that at the household level it was actually making a difference to people's livelihoods. That resulted in the report we published on responsible tourism in Karakoram. You can find it on my publications page. And in 2017, the minister in Kerala set up the Responsible Tourism Mission with Rupesh Kumar at its head. Subsequently, the ideas were picked up and adopted in Madhya Pradesh, and they're now spreading by example and replication to other states. And this describes, this is evidence of the way in which replication speeds progress. It's the fact that Manoj Singh picked up the ideas from Rupesh and introduced them into Madhya Pradesh, which is a predominantly Hindu and BJP state, is what's led to the spread of responsible tourism through India. It's no longer just in Kerala. So that today there's a vibrant movement across India led by the ICRT Foundation in India, led by Manisha Pandey. And that group is increasingly influential. I think it's fair to say that India is now the most successful country in the world for implementing responsible tourism. 2 decades on from the Cape Town Declaration, seemed a good time to look back and to look at what had been successful and why, and to produce a new shorter charter on responsible tourism. That was produced and signed on Magna Carta Island in London in November 2022. And it includes much of what was in the Cape Town Declaration about responsibility driving sustainability, about diversity, and the need to explain why we take responsibility and the things we choose to improve through tourism, and most important of all, perhaps, the impacts of our efforts. And I would just point out that the work the EU is now doing on verification and the Green Claims Directive means that ability to demonstrate that we've made a real difference matters more than it used to. Greenhouse gas emissions, plastic waste, and biodiversity extinction all require local action, although they are global issues. They need to be dealt with locally, and they'll need to be dealt with locally in different ways. Potable water is also a global issue. It's impacting in many places, but it's not an issue everywhere, whereas greenhouse gas emissions, plastic waste, and biodiversity extinction are. It's important to set goals and to take measures and to report on how you can minimize the negative and increase the positive impacts. So that creating economic benefits for local people, enhancing their well-being, providing better employment conditions, and so on. It's about involving local people in decision making, and that is still remarkably rare. One of the reasons I think responsible tourism has had success in Kerala in particular is because of the village panchayats, the lowest level of local government, where there's been heavy involvement from the local administrative and elected representatives. Makes positive contribution to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage, addresses biodiversity loss, provides inclusive employment for the differently abled and peoples of different ethnicities, gender and sexual orientation, and for guests provides more enjoyable experiences, but also more meaningful connections, and offers culturally sensitive experiences, engendering respect between the hosts and the tourists, and building local pride and confidence. And it's a call to action to explain why we focus on particular issues, what we're doing to address them, recognizing that transparent and auditable reporting on the impacts of our efforts is essential to demonstrate what is being achieved by taking responsibility. And without taking responsibility, we can't conceivably move our sector towards sustainability. So it's a broad movement, perhaps 5,000 activists and practitioners, perhaps 20,000. It's impossible to be specific. We've got 21 years of Responsible Tourism Award entrants and winners and their staff. We've got all the people who've done a Masters in Responsible Tourism, perhaps now around 500. We've got the signatories to the Responsible Tourism Charter. We've got the subscribers to Responsible Tourism News and the LinkedIn groups. We've got regional networks in the Indian subcontinent, in Southern Africa, West Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Nordic countries. There's a lot going on, but there's a lot to do. And I hope that the ICRT Global will accelerate development because it will be able to share, enable people in Africa to share ideas with Latin America and Asia and vice versa. And really, we need to accelerate progress by learning from each other about what works. It's always impossible just to copy, but by looking at what other people have done and listening to how they did it, we're often stimulated to find ways more quickly of achieving the change we all want to see.